on this. I think we can, we can do this pretty quickly and do what we need to do for these documents, and then uh, be able to move on. Um, so we've got just two things to review today. That's Vasco da Gama's reactions to indigenous peoples, and then Columbus's letter about his first voyage to the Americas. Both of these documents have to do with reactions to indigenous peoples as kind of Westerners encounter people living in the Americas for the first time. Let me bring up the paper prompts here for this week so I can speak intelligently to it as we discuss the documents, because I just need to know exactly what I asked you to write about. So
we'll only be going over the documents today?
yeah. There's, I posted a thing from early in this week about discussing first contact between Europeans and Native Americans. That's on Blackboard.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we're really only talking about the documents today for this week. So the paper for this week asks you to write about a couple of things. The first is Westerners encountering different people and ideas for the first time, and this has to do with not only the Renaissance, but what we're talking about today, which is exploration. And the paper prompt also asks you to identify ways in which Westerners brought Christian worldview into these contacts. So it's going to be very helpful, I think, for you guys to be here today, because we're talking directly about both of these two things, both first contact and the kind of preconceived notions that Europeans bring with them into exploration, and also the rediscovery of old like Greek and Roman ideas like during the Renaissance. So we'll start out with Vasco da Gama. I don't know if anybody's read the documents. I know we're getting late into the semester, and diligence tends to drop off, and I understand that. But if you have read the document for Vasco da Gama, this is on page 410 of your book. How would you describe the first encounter between these Portuguese explorers and these indigenous peoples living in, well, I guess India? This is about encountering the Indians. Any impressions you got about sort of this, the way they describe the Indians, or was it a peaceful meeting, or was it kind of a violent first contact? Like,
I'm gonna be 100% honest. I actually am not able to read anything until day of.
Yeah.
Of the paper, but I'm pretty sure I remember this. Didn't they give them like corn and stuff, and they're like, "Oh no, come in, this is okay."
In this particular context, Vasco da Gama, he goes east, and he tries to plot new trade routes, or at least predictable and stable trade routes to the east. And he does kind of present the folks in Calcutta with trinkets, various things that he says they've never seen before. They brought with them kind of animals, like as gifts. They brought with them, let's see, cinnamon, cloves, seed pearls, gold, and many other things. And he says he says it was evident they had no knowledge whatsoever of these things. So they took kind of little bells and tin rings, like kind of the metal, kind of cheap but durable stuff, because they thought they were cool. So yeah, there is this element of gift giving upon first contact. It's like, hey, we're here, we come in peace. Here's a bunch of stuff from the West you've never seen before, which they definitely have seen precious metals before. But the way that Vasco da Gama portrays them is kind of these ignorant indigenous Indians, like in this case, living actually in India. They're these kind of childlike people because they've never seen Western stuff before, and therefore they're ignorant and kind of stupid. So that's, if you're thinking about like what to write about still for this assignment, there's this common thread that you see through a lot of documents about first contact from Westerners to elsewhere, which was like, hey, we showed them cool things like cinnamon, and they were so dumb they didn't know what to do with it, and kind of really playing up the unfamiliarity between the two cultures, and in kind of a sleazy and tricky way, elevating the Westerners above everyone else that they encounter, because like, hey, we have all these cool things, why don't you? You guys must be poor or stupid, something like that. There's this automatic value judgment that comes with first contact. So to follow up on that, he talks about sort of the odd behaviors of people living in Calcutta. This is really interesting, is he says, and he spends a lot of time talking about this in the document. He says the city of Calcutta is inhabited by Christians. They're of tawny complexion. They have big beards, long hair. They wear mustaches. They pierce their ears and wear lots of gold in them. They go naked down to the waist. But they also shave parts of their head, allowing a tuft to remain on the crown as a sign that they're Christian. And he kind of goes on, and he goes to like different shrines, and Vasco da Gama is convinced that the people that he encounters in here are Christian. They are not. They're Buddhist. Why do you think Vasco da Gama would go over here and identify religious people automatically as Christian, despite this not being a Christianized part of the world? Why do you think he would confuse Buddhists for Christians? Like, why would he see religious people as Christian?
Is it because it's so widespread now that they're just like, oh, you worship one God, I worship one God. Obviously, it's Christianity.
Perhaps, this is in the West, everyone is at least is nominally Christian, Catholic at this time. So he would probably just assume, everyone else in the world is Christian as well. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Like, Seth, I saw you unmuted. Do you have any thoughts on that?
They have really similar values in just like how you should live life, how you should treat others, and all that.
Okay. Yeah, they see these people walking around, giving alms to the poor, worshiping in shrines, praying. Yeah, there's there's values there. Buddhism is all about understanding the nature of suffering and trying to. There's lots of different strains of Buddhism, right? But a lot of Buddhists try and find internal spiritual ways of finding inner peace and transcending the suffering of this world, which, if you think about it, has a lot of similarities with Christian values, right? Yeah, Jesus, shows up and he performs lots of miracles according to the Bible, but his goal is different than his contemporaries thought. People thought he was going to save them from the Roman Empire. He was going to liberate Judea, and in the Christian tradition, it's Jesus showed up to save your soul, to cover your sins. He came to, if you want to look at it from a Buddhist perspective, he came to give you inner peace, right? So there are a lot of similarities there, enough so that on first impression, Vasco da Gama would be like, oh, these religious people, they're kind of weird looking and they're kind of ignorant, but they're basically Christian, right? They might as well be, even though their shrines and their prayers are different and the manner in which they dress and I don't understand what they're saying, but like, I assume they're down with Jesus, And this is a really interesting moment because Vasco da Gama takes his Western preconceived Christian worldview and he imposes it on the non-West, right? He goes to Calicut and he sees religious people and he just assumes that they're the same faith as him. Now this is wrong. They're Buddhist, right? They don't know about Jesus. Like they would probably be interested. I'm sure they go at great lengths to try and convert people there to Christianity. But when he shows up, all he knows is the Christian West. And so when he encounters something different, instead of asking questions, instead of exploring the differences between the two cultures, he immediately transposes his own Western Christian worldview on these other folks. And that's interesting, right? I don't know if you guys have traveled anywhere outside of the country, but especially if you go to a very different culture, you get this thing called culture shock when you're in a brand new place for the first time and you're suddenly the minority, it's a shock because you're like, oh my gosh, everything I see is unfamiliar. I don't fit in at all. And you find ways to cope with that. The way of culture, you either withdraw or you find other people that look and talk like you, a way of dealing with the unknown is to find what's familiar. And so what Vasco da Gama is basically doing is he's transposing his Western Christianized worldview on a completely different part of the world where that worldview it's not accurate. But it's a way of him, I think, a way of him coping with the unknown, right? He's trying to find similarities between the two cultures. And it helps him kind of reconcile, oh my gosh, these people actually aren't Christian. They don't know what I'm talking about. But they do have similar values, or they appear to be similar in these ways. And therefore they're less scary to me. The unknown is less scary and frightening. So I think that's something to keep in mind, right? And that's definitely something to write about. He mistakes Buddhists for Christians because he is trying to reconcile being in a different part of the world, in a completely different worldview, completely different culture, completely different religious background, completely different religion or language. It's a way that people try and cope, and Westerners are no exception to this. Anything else you want to say on Vasco da Gama before we move on to Columbus, everyone's favorite explorer, Christopher Columbus?
There's a term in psychology and sociology for that where you basically go into a country with a lot of bias from your own country. let's say you went to Italy, you'd be like, oh, they don't speak my language here, instead of being like, oh, they speak Italian.
Right.
But I'm trying to find the term and I can't remember it.
Yeah, if you think of it, let me know. That would be very helpful to have that term, carry that around my back pocket, because all I can think of is in terms of culture shock. It's, I guess, just because that's what I've experienced. But I would love to know the psychological term for that kind of bias, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, it's bias.
Yeah. Yeah. When you automatically just think of something different in terms of what you know. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of mental self-critique and self-awareness to overcome that. When you try, because it takes a lot of empathy, right? To be able to look at someone else's circumstances and try and see it from their point of view rather than see it from your point of view. That's hard. And it doesn't come naturally to a lot of people.
I haven't found the term yet, but I would like to let you know that one way you could say that is schema, because a schema is when basically you have a bias. So it's like presenting your pre-existing schema with a new one. So then you're like, oh, but I already have this form schema. I'm not going to change it.
Yeah. That works really well. I think that idea of a model in your head, that you carry with you wherever you go. Yeah. So I think that's something to keep in mind as we read, about these documents, and as you start to write, either if you haven't started the paper yet, or you for the final exam in a couple weeks, the ways in which the West encounters the rest of the world is through these models, and it's usually a very Christian-centric model. Which I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's just a reality. Okay, so Columbus. Columbus is the letter from his first voyage. This is a very famous letter. Obviously, everyone knows about Christopher Columbus. If you were in the Tuesday meeting, I ranted a bit about Christopher Columbus. I'm not a big fan of his. He did a lot of very nasty things upon first contact with the indigenous peoples in the Caribbean. And he kind of tips his hand to this a little bit in his first letter. Not a lot. He very much writes about himself in very glowing, narcissistic, egotistical terms, because Columbus was a narcissist. But he also describes the indigenous Arawak people in the place that he calls Hispaniola. He describes them in very pointed ways. So this document starts on page 414. This is him writing back to Isabella and Ferdinand, which are basically the king and queen of what's basically Spain at this point. Spain is not a united country yet, but it's quickly getting there. And he writes back, and he says a few different things about the people that he encounters there. A lot of it starts on page 415. He describes the landscape as being this kind of empty area, this island that's very empty. It's not very widely inhabited. He said it's very beautiful, and there's a lot of natural resources that the indigenous people seem to not really care about. Like, they have not exploited their environment like they should be doing. And again, he's very much transposing his Western kind of idea of farming, agriculture, improving the land, which is how you lay claim to land in old Roman traditional law and Western law. To own a title to the land, you have to farm it. Once you've improved the land, you own it. Columbus looks at the kind of virgin landscapes of Hispaniola, and he says the indigenous people here have not improved the land. Therefore, they don't really care about it that much, or they must be pretty stupid. And this is his kind of first critique of the indigenous people that he encounters in America, in the Americas. There's large tracts of cultivatable land. There's honey, there's birds of many kinds, fruits in great diversity. In the interior are mines of metals, and the population is without number. Hispaniola is a marvel. And so he starts talking about the Americas. He starts talking about this island in the Americas in a very covetous way. Like you can kind of see Columbus, scheming. He's like, how can I take this land? And he does. He claims it for Spain. So on the bottom of page 415, this is how he describes his contact with the indigenous. The people of this island and of all the other islands which I've found, in which I have information, they all go naked, men and women, as their mothers bore them. Although some women cover a single place with a leaf or a plant. They've got no iron or steel or weapons, nor are they fitted to use them, not because they're not well built, but because they are very marvelously timorous. They have no arms other than weapons made out of canes, and they don't make use of these. So this is a very passive people, he says. They're very peaceful, they're non-violent, they don't have weapons, they don't have metal. They all walk around naked. He paints this kind of picture of a primitive people group. And then he starts offering them kind of trinkets and stuff, and they're kind of looking at glass and whatnot and marvel. So he paints them and he describes them as childlike. He compares them to children in their intelligence and in their exposure to the outside world. I'm trying to find some other kind of ways that he's describing them. It's been a week or two since I've read this document.
I found the term and I put it in the chat.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, ethnocentrism, yes. Yes. And that can take a pernicious kind of negative. There's two different ways of carrying around your ethnocentrism. One is that's what I know, and that's how I view the world. And then and as you become more exposed to other ideas, that ethnocentrism starts to fall away. And then there's a more pernicious, malicious way of ethnocentrism, which is the way it's described here is my culture is better than yours, and no matter what I'm exposed to, I'm always going to think that, right? I'm never going to be open-minded to new or better ideas. Whatever my culture has is the best form of humanity. Full stop. And sometimes that's a very American way of looking at the rest of the world. I found that Americans, because we're so isolated from most other cultures in a proximity, we can't easily travel and visit other countries unless it's Canada, which is very, very Western and American in many ways, or Mexico. It's hard to get to other countries, whereas people living in France can take a train and go see Germany in a couple hours. They have a much more flexible view of their own ethnocentrism, whereas Americans tend to see the foreign as automatically bad and scary and coming to take our jobs and whatever else. Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, for pointing that out. What Columbus decides to do is take back some people with him back to Spain and kind of use them as human trophies. He's like, look, I found these weird exotic people living in Hispaniola. Aren't they funny looking? They're not Christian, therefore we need to make them Christian. And he has a very kind of Western attitude towards the Americas. Like he has a very European Christian centric way of looking at things, just like Vasco da Gama. But whereas da Gama is more passive in his ethnocentrism, Columbus is a little bit more malicious. Like he wants to make the Americas more like Europe. He wants to capture and subjugate these people. He wants to force them to convert, and he wants to enslave them because they're stupid and inferior. That is Columbus really sets the tone for Western worldviews towards indigenous peoples. It's kind of sad the way that he goes about exploration, because it's one of greed and subjugation. Rather than just seeing the humanity in other people, he sees the indigenous Arawaks as people to be exploited. The fact that they walk around naked means that they're childlike and stupid. The fact that they don't have weapons means that they can be subjugated quite easily and enslaved quite easily. The fact that they're not Christian means that they are doomed to eternal damnation if we don't rescue their poor souls from their own ignorance. These are all ways in which Columbus very maliciously imposes his Western worldview on other people during first contact. Does that make sense? Like, does all this make sense?
That does make sense.
Okay. And like, I'm trying my best to, be neutral about this, but 50 years after Columbus arrives, 90% of the Arawak population is dead. Like, this is a very, I think the best way to describe it is ethnocentrism, right? Columbus is believing his own culture is far superior to what he encounters in the Caribbean. And the conclusion from the way of like resolving that ethnocentrism is to just impose himself on the indigenous people. Whereas like Vasco da Gama is there to trade, and yeah, he confuses Buddhists for Christians, but it's all good, right? We're all just like moral people just trying to get along. Like he's down with the Buddhists. Whereas Columbus wants to exploit these people. And this,
I'm in the book right now. I finally opened it. And it literally says in one of the paragraphs, I took by force some of them in order that they might learn.
Yeah, I took them by force. I kidnapped them to save them from themselves, right? Like, I'm saving them so that they may learn. I'm saving them from their own ignorance. These people, I could leave them alone. I could let them be. But then they wouldn't know anything about true civilization, right? I kidnapped them to save them from themselves. That's Columbus's attitude towards first contact with other people, and it's terrifying. Like, I'll make my biases against Columbus well known here. He is the colonizer. Like, he is the like prototypical Westerner who just throws his weight around and tries to learn from other people and other cultures. Like, he tries to make the rest of the world mirror the West, economically, politically, culturally. Columbus makes many voyages to the Americas, and each time he kind of entrenches Western power in the Caribbean. And it's this attitude of like, I need to save these people from themselves. We need to set up slave mines, put these people to work so that they can mine precious minerals for Spain, and become Christian. Otherwise, they're just sitting around naked on the beach. What good is that? They're not farming. They're just living their own happy lives. I hate that. So Christopher Columbus is a terrible person, and one can see that. But it's also, he kicks off kind of Western attitudes towards the Americas in the sense that from this point on, nothing is ever the same. The Americas are there to be exploited, and they are. They're colonized by the Christian West, and for better or worse, the Americas become part of the West, and they resemble Europe in lots of ways, and that indigenous cultural imprint is swept away in large measure, except for the times when we name our football teams after the native people who used to live on the land that Westerners now occupy. So I think that's, you can draw a lot from that. Like if you're still working on this prompt, there's a lot to explore there. Question number one is, how do Westerners, what attitudes do they bring? Did it change Western worldview at all? Did it reinforce Western worldviews? Definitely in the context of Columbus, yeah, like it only strengthened his ethnocentrism. Da Gama's a little bit different, where he passively brings his own cultural worldview into his exploration, but he doesn't necessarily try and impose anything on the people in Calicut. He's using what's familiar to try and interpret difference. Whereas Columbus he's there to exploit. What ways in which Westerners do they bring their Christian ideas to the table? Vasco da Gama sees Buddhists as Christian because that's what he's familiar with. Columbus sees the Arawak people as childlike and as ignorant, and he's going to take them by force to save them from themselves. So there's this, there's a huge gulf there. If Vasco da Gama is, like I've said, like he's bringing his Christian worldview to other parts of the world. Columbus is being much more forceful about it. And he kind of justifies kidnapping people as, saving them from their own ignorance. Yeah. So these two documents talk a lot they speak a lot to the paper prompt for this week. Any questions, any sort of any comments you want to make, any other kind of thoughts that you have about these two things? Or I know I've been talking a lot, but.
I think it's interesting because I've just been flipping through it while you're talking as well. Don't worry, I'm still absorbing information. I'm not ignoring you. But he physically says at one point, in all these islands, I saw no great diversity in appearance of these people or their manners and language.
Yeah.
Like, you think they'd be different, Because I imagine they were only able to speak with one another because they'd been around each other for so long. So there were some symbols that they knew, but surely they all had diversity.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's this fundamental misunderstanding of the people that he's encountering. Like Columbus does not try very hard to activate his own humanity and his own empathy towards these other people. he just, now a lot of it, I mean, look, like we could talk about the motivation. Like I'm sure he's sugarcoating a ton of stuff that actually happened on this journey, because he's trying to put his best foot forward when he's writing back to his bosses, which are the monarchs of Spain. So he's probably not being super honest in his evaluation sometimes. But he really like following that paragraph, or later on in that paragraph, he says, on the contrary, they all understand each other, which is a very curious thing, on account of which I hope their highnesses will determine upon their conversion to our holy faith, towards which they are very inclined. He's writing back to the king and queen of Spain saying, oh, these people they love Christian. They want to convert so bad. I'm sure that probably wasn't the case. Like a lot of people were curious, like the indigenous people were curious about Columbus and the things he had to say. But were they rushing to just abandon their own identities and just eagerly embrace, Western everything? No, like no one does that. So he's being very manipulative here and very dishonest, and he's not trying to understand these people. Da Gama is a little bit, right? He's trying to understand. He's not doing a great job of it because he conflates Buddhism for Christianity, but he's at least kind of trying. Columbus is not. He's there to exploit people and exploit the land. And unfortunately, this kind of sets the tone for Western colonialism going forward. We get the Columbian Exchange, which is the slave trade in the Atlantic, shortly after this. So yeah, you've pointed out some good things, Stephanie. I think you're definitely on the right track here. Any other comments or questions anyone has about these documents? I think we've really covered the main parts.
For the paper this week, would it be fine to use just the documents?
Yeah, I mean
okay.
Yeah, definitely. These two documents, and then the ones from last week, which were the Renaissance.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I want you to focus on those. You don't really have to pull anything from the textbook in these papers if you don't want to. Yeah.
Okay, I was writing down some quotes. All right.
I mean, you definitely can. Like, that's fine too. Like, you're not ever going to be penalized for using more sources. But I'd like you to use these documents to answer the questions. Like I'd like you to. That's the whole point of these exercises, is to exercise critical analysis of firsthand accounts and use them to answer historical questions. So yes is the long answer to your question. Any other questions or comments or concerns or anything? Sorry, I railed against Columbus so much. Sorry, not sorry. I just really don't like Christopher Columbus. And we definitely should not put him on a pedestal in this country, because he did a lot of nasty stuff that no one seems to remember. Except you guys, because you read because you're in college. You're college educated students, and you have a better understanding of history than most people ever will.
I think that the whole reason people still celebrate him so much is because we're physically taught in lower grades that he was like one of the greatest people in the world. Mm-hmm. They're like, yeah, he technically made a mistake and found the wrong thing, but like then we found America, so it's okay.
Yeah, it's all good because America.
They're like, that's his only mistake. That's why we have a holiday.
Yeah, no, you're right. He's I've talked about this a lot in the past in different classes and different contexts, and I'm always asking the question, like, why do we do this? Like, why do we continue this heroic myth of Christopher Columbus? in grade school and just in culture in general. And there's a few different ways to answer that. You know, one is like kids can't grasp very easily the idea of like a guy who came over here just to exploit people. Like, you don't want to teach them colonialism, you know, in second grade or something. Like, that's kind of a bummer. Kids need heroes, you know, to see. But also, I think like just a lot of it is we don't care about Indigenous history in this country. Like, we would just rather not talk about it. Like, we're not interested in yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say that it kind of seems we only talk about it very, very briefly. Like, oh, yeah, we met him for Thanksgiving and we just had a great party and it was so fun. Oh my God. And then we just talk about the Trail of Tears and we're like, yeah, it's so sad. But like, we did it ourselves. And they totally just grace over that fact. Like, oh, don't worry. It was just this really bad group of people that totally don't represent America in any way.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, we had this one moment. It was really bad. But, you know, besides that.
We have reservations now. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we gave them parcels of land, you know, that they can barely live on.
They can't vote.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's I don't think we're interested in you know, it's a big bummer to look at the real history of this country and this land and its origins. And it's a huge bummer, and we meaning like mainstream American, you know, white Anglo-Saxon, whatever. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for us to look at the history of the country and see it as one that's built on the bones of, you know, massacred Indigenous, and that's uncomfortable. So I think that's why we don't talk about it a lot. You know, that's why it takes a huge effort just to get the, you know, the Redskins football team name changed finally in 2020. Like it like, my gosh, like it took simple things like that, you know, simple acknowledgments that like maybe racism is not okay. It's really hard. It's really hard to get past that for a lot of people. So, all right. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk about colonialism and racism. If you think of any other questions you have about the documents or the paper, let me know. Oh, I'll tell you guys this. A couple things. We're probably not meeting next week. Like this could very well be the last meeting of this class. We're definitely not doing a Zoom on Tuesday next week. That's because I'm in this hiring committee interview process thing. And very possibly not on Friday as well. So next week, just assume that we're not meeting. Which isn't to say you can't contact me or during office hours or anything, or email, but we're not going to be meeting for class. I'm also getting I'm working on the final today. The final stuff will be up on Blackboard for you to check out by the end of today. So you'll have like a whole week and a half to work on the final. And it's open book. It's just like the other exams we've done in this class.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's open book, open note. You have a ton of time to work on it. It's just due by the end of Wednesday. Not next week, but the week after.
So the 16th?
The 16th, yes.
Okay.
So I'll send out, you know, announcement and an email so you have that in writing, and you can look back on that in case you forget. But I wanted to let you know now while you're here. All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for I know it's been a weird semester, but you guys made it an enjoyable class, and I thank you for that. So.